I've only shared this story one other time before with my brother. Several years ago, I was in my mid-20s, and honestly, I was a bit of a loser. I was in and out of different jobs, and I'd already dropped out of college 2 times. I still lived at home with my parents, and it wasn't something I was proud of, but I couldn't afford my own place yet. Next door to my parents' house was a man named Zeke. This wasn't his real name, but he often said nobody knew his real name, so everybody just called him Zeke. Now, it's important to note in this story that Zeke was a miserable, middle-aged man. He was probably about 6 foot tall, with a decent build other than a slowly developing beer belly. He was slightly bald on top and had long hair about shoulder length, and had a scruffy beard. Every time we saw Zeke, he looked angry or mad about something. We used to say that he didn't sleep, mainly because he used to have these huge bags under his eyes. He rarely left the house, and when he did, he usually came back within minutes. Zeke wasn't always like this, though. My parents have always lived next door to him, and when I was a little kid, he used to live there with his family. He had a wife and 2 daughters, and I think we were about the same age. I remember oftentimes we would be in the backyard, having cookouts and swimming in the pool that he used to have in his yard. Actually, we would go over for cookouts all the time when I was younger. It seemed like the perfect family. Suddenly, though, things just seemed to diminish. My family and I would hear fights next door that always ended with the police being called. We would hear the poor children crying as Zeke would unleash his verbal violence on the family. Now, my parents have lived here since before I was born, and they would often say that they had never heard this family fight, and they always seemed like really great people. Well, not before long, the verbal fights became too much, and then one night, in the middle of the night, Zeke's wife left with the children, and I don't really remember all the details. I just remember staring out of my bedroom window as Zeke yelled at them to get out and never come back while he held a baseball bat in his hand. I remember being scared, but I couldn't look away. The woman got in the car with the 2 girls, and they left. As they drove off, Zeke walked back into the room that was directly adjacent to my bedroom window, and he sat in a chair facing the wall. As I grew up, this is where Zeke spent most of his time. No TV or no radio, at least that I could see. He would sit in this yellow room and stare at the yellow walls. He would sometimes drink beer, sometimes he would cry, and sometimes he would appear to be talking, but most of the time, he just sat there, as still as a statue. Fast forward to the time of this story, and it was the middle of the summer. Most of my friends were going on some beach trip, but I was broke and I had no job, so I was staying home. One night I was sitting on my porch and Zeke came over to me. Probably the first conversation I've had with a man in 15 to 20 years. He told me that he had won some contest and that he won a free couple nights stay at some private resort in the mountains. He asked if I would watch his cat and just make sure the house was okay. He told me he would pay me, so of course I accepted. He gave me a key and told me that the cat food was on the counter and that I couldn't miss it. He told me to come over at 6 p.m. and to use the back door because nobody uses the front door anymore. I found it super weird that he didn't physically show me where the food was or even introduce me to the cat or anything. He just gave me the key and left. But I guess I just figured he's a miserable man and that's how he is. 6 p.m. I showed up at his house and walked to the back door like I was directed. The backyard was disgusting and not how I remembered. The pool had no water in it and was filled with half dirt and half murky liquid. The grass was either dead or super overgrown in spots. There was trash and broken lawn furniture everywhere. I walked into the house and the smell was horrible. It smelled like rotten meat. It was seriously repulsive, but I guess people can go nose blind to certain smells. When you walked through the back door, you walked into a long hallway. There were 2 rooms to the left and 2 rooms to the right. The first 2 on the left were the 2 little girls' rooms. It was haunting and a little sad because the rooms looked untouched. There were still toys on the floor and clothes folded on the dresser. One of the rooms had a board game on the ground that looked like it was in mid-game. The first room on the right was the master bedroom. There was a king bed that wasn't made but hadn't looked slept in years. Again, the room just looked abandoned. There were clothes, including what I imagined were his ex-wife's clothes, on the dresser, all folded. The second room on the right had a shut door, but a light shining underneath the doorway. I opened the door and it was the yellow room that I could see from my bedroom. But I could barely concentrate on the room because when I opened the door, I was almost knocked out by the smell. And there was also a major chill when I opened up the door. It was like opening the door to a walk-in cooler. I shut the door and made my way to the kitchen and the living room that was at the end of the hall. All my friends were partying on some beach, and I was in this disgusting and depressing house, regretting my choice to help Zeke. I found the cat dish and the cat food, but no sign of any cat. I poured the food into the dish and just tried to take in my surroundings. The kitchen looked like a bomb exploded. Garbage and trash were everywhere. It was clear that Zeke really gave up on life, but I figured it wasn't my place to judge. While I was looking at the train wreck of a kitchen, I couldn't shake this feeling of wanting to go back and look in that yellow room. I made my way back down the hall to shut the door. It was the weirdest thing to explain, but suddenly the smell didn't bother me anymore. And I didn't even notice the cold. When I opened up the door, I could feel the cold blast my face, but like I said, it didn't bother me. The room was weird. There was a brown wooden chair in the middle of the room that just faced the wall. The bottom of the wall had a small vent that had some burn marks on the side of it. I can't explain why, but I just stood and stared at the vent for a few minutes. I finally broke my stare and looked around the room. There were scratch marks all over the hardwood floors. They were most prevalent in the opposite corner of the room. Also in the corner was the bat that I saw him holding all those years ago when his family left and never came back. My heart began to sink because I thought I could hear voices down in the basement through the vents. It was the strangest feeling I had ever had. I started to focus on the vent again, trying to hear what the voices were saying. They sounded muffled, but they were clearly voices. It sounded like a woman. Maybe I have seen one too many movies, but the first place that my mind went was that this man had his family trapped in the basement. I finally broke my trance in the yellow room and wanted to investigate the basement. When I turned to leave the room, I noticed that the door was shut. And I know I didn't shut the door. Officially freaked out and still on edge about the voices, I kicked open the door and made my way to the basement door, which was off of the kitchen. I almost passed out when I ran by the clock in the kitchen and saw that it was after 3 o'clock in the morning. I got there at 6 p.m., and it only felt like a few minutes went by. Somehow, I blacked out a huge chunk of the night. I didn't try to explain what was happening, I just needed to save the people that were in the basement. And at least that was my thought. There was a giant pile of trash that was blocking the door. I kicked it all down, trying to get to the doorknob. After some struggle, I got to the knob and forced the door open. It was freezing. Even more freezing than the house and the yellow room. I could smell that horrible smell again, and the voices were even louder. I turned on the light, ran downstairs, and yelled, "Does anybody need any help?" There was nobody down there. It was empty. After a moment, the only light that was down there blew out, and I was left with just a little bit of illumination through the basement windows from the streetlights. With the orange glow, I could see some kind of silhouette in the back of the room. I asked if it needed any help in a really tentative voice, and the large, dark shadow grew and started to move toward me. I screamed and I just ran. As I ran up the stairs, I heard a growl and what sounded like hissing. I made my way up the stairs and was running down the long hallway that seemed to last forever. I could again hear the muffled voices that I had heard earlier. That's when I saw the single most terrifying thing that I had ever seen in my entire life. I got to the back door and I turned around briefly before shutting the door, and that's when I saw it. I saw a gigantic, pitch-black entity of some kind at the end of the hall. It looked like it had a bright white face and blacked out eyes, surrounded by what I could only call a black mass. I turned and I ran as fast as I could. I didn't run back home, I just kept running. I ran all the way to the local 24/7 market, and I sat on the park bench until the sun rose that morning. I went home and hugged both of my parents. I didn't explain to them what happened, and I'm sure they wouldn't believe me anyway. I have no history of mental episodes or even vivid nightmares. I can't explain what happened that night. The positive thing that came from this story was that it made me change my life around. I took this as a sign and I went back to school, and I'm actually on track to graduate next year. I took 2 jobs after this event so I could afford my own apartment and I wouldn't have to look at that yellow room anymore. Perhaps the most terrifying thing is that Zeke never came back to that house after the night he left. My parents tried calling the police, but he ended up just staying missing. They found his car, but they never found any sign of him. I'm not even sure if his ex-wife and daughters were ever notified, and I wouldn't even begin to know how to reach them. The house remains there, boarded up, and I hope it remains locked and boarded up forever. Anybody who has ever camped in the Adirondack area of upstate New York knows just how breathtaking and beautiful it can be this time of year. Last summer, I stayed with my family in a cabin that rested in the mountains. I had recently split up with my longtime girlfriend, and it seemed like a wonderful place to go to clear my head. At first, my theory was correct. It was therapeutic and beautiful being out in nature and spending time with my family. One of the really nice things about this cabin was that it was truly separated from any other residence. The closest cabin or campsite was probably at least a mile or more away. This meant that we had total and complete privacy. Or so we thought. One late afternoon, probably around 5, we heard some shuffling coming from the front of the cabin. We were sitting on the back porch and just heard some movement that sounded like footsteps. A little on edge, my brother and I got up and got ready, just in case we needed to leap into action. All of a sudden, 2 middle-aged men walked into the back from where we were sitting. I asked in a very abrasive and annoyed voice, "Hey, what are you doing? Can I help you with something?" The men just looked, laughed, and in a cheery voice said, "Why, hello, young man. My name is Lewis, and this is Tito. We just really wanted to check the place out. We heard it had a great view, and we just heard so many wonderful stories." I mean, the man seemed sincere, but something just didn't seem right to me. I still looked at them with an uneasy feeling in my stomach, but my mom, who was a very friendly person, made small talk with the man. Perhaps the most unsettling thing about this entire interaction was the friend, Tito, was just standing around, looking at the house with no facial movements or anything. Lewis was charismatic, smiled a lot, and made eye contact, whereas Tito was almost the complete opposite. After several minutes of small talk, they vanished back into the woods. I was not a fan of that at all, and quickly let my family know about it. Where were these guys coming from, I thought. As I stated previously, the closest place was about a mile or so away, and that place belonged to the guy who owned the cabin we were staying in. So Lewis and Tito must have been hiking for a little while just to get to our cabin, which is not really unlikely up in the Adirondacks, but something didn't feel right about the entire interaction. It bothered me all night. Around 11, my family went to bed, and I sat around the fire with my brother and his fiancée. Every little noise I heard caused me to jump. These strange guys bothered me more than I even realized. My brother told me not to worry about it, and that I was just worrying too much over nothing. I pretended everything was okay, but I knew deep down inside of me that something wasn't right. Shortly after midnight, it was just my brother and me around the fire. We decided to let the last few logs burn out before we went in. This is when Lewis decided to pay us another visit, and this time, he was not so friendly. My brother and I jumped out of our chairs and were now facing Lewis and Tito, who were coming out of the woods. They looked crazy. Lewis did not have that same charming personality as before, and was now almost deranged in his look. His eyes were bugging from his head, and he flashed his pearly white teeth in an almost sadistic way. Tito, who was almost a statue earlier in the day, stood next to Lewis, also smiling, and slowly started to approach me and my brother. As Lewis approached us, he said, "This cabin is really lovely, and I think we'll be staying here now." He reached into his bag as if to pull something out. Tito, who was slightly behind him, was already wielding some sort of bushwhacking sword. Not trying to take any chances as to what Lewis was pulling out of the bag, my brother decided to tackle the man. He went down with relative ease. As Tito approached my brother with the sword, I ran over and pushed him, strictly only using adrenaline as my motivator. Both men got up and backed away. Lewis was now standing about 10 feet away, and he just kept saying, "You have no idea who I am and who you're messing with. I built this house. This is my land." After repeating this a couple of times, Tito finally spoke up as well, and in an almost robotic voice he said, "We shall have our land back. We must wait for the right time." Tito grabbed the shoulder of Lewis, and they both ran into the woods. Remember, this is after midnight in the woods. It was pitch black other than a slightly dim light from the dying fire. We put the fire out rather quickly and went inside of the cabin and made sure all the doors and windows were locked. My brother and I stayed up all night and basically watched the property to make sure they did not come back. I have never been so happy to see the sun in my entire life. The next day we went to see the property owner and told him about the entire night. He said he had never heard the two names before and assured me that no Lewis ever built the house. The owner, whom we were renting the cabin from, told us that he built the cabin 10 years ago. So, who were these two that claimed to be the ones that built the cabin? We reported the invasion and then left. The owner was kind enough to refund us the rest of the nights we were supposed to stay at the cabin. I know this could have ended much worse for us, and all things considered, I'm very lucky that I left with no more than some minor psychological damage. If we did not go into fight mode right away, who's to say what would have happened? I count my lucky stars every day that I'm alive to tell this story. It may not be scary to some of you who read this, but put yourself in the pitch black forest with these two crazy men and weapons, and I'm sure you'd be scared too. Be safe, everyone, and always lock your doors. You never know who could be creeping around outside right now.